Hello, and welcome to the Planet of Horror, where we cover your worst nightmares. I'm your host Kate, and here at the Planet of Horror, we bring you true crime cases from all over the world. We cover cases you've heard about and cases you haven't. We strive to give you the most accurate and memorable coverage so you can stay informed on the most important and interesting cases from around the world. You can find me under the Planet of Horror on all social media networks. This week we are talking about serial killers, and the one in particular I'll be diving into today is a British serial killer that operated in the north of England around the Leeds, Bradford, Manchester area in the 1970s and 80s. He killed 13 women and attacked a further 8 that we know of between 1975 and 1980. Disclaimer before I get into this case, that I mean no disrespect to anyone involved in these cases, and I'm purely compiling facts I've researched online. I would say this episode covers a lot of graphic content, such as rape, torture, murder, and if any of this kind of thing is triggering for you, please stop the video now. This case in particular is controversial for the way that the media and the police treated the victims throughout this case, purely focusing on the killer murdering sex workers, which was not the case, and it was arguably this focus that hindered them from catching him. But with that being said, a lot of this research has come from the media outlets, so that's why things are sometimes phrased the way that they are. The serial killer discussed in this episode was first dubbed Jack the Ripper by the local press, due to the victim pool of the killer being very similar to that of the famous serial killer with the same name, who targeted prostitutes in London during the 1800s. This did get confusing, so the press changed his name to simply The Ripper, which was then eventually changed to the Yorkshire Ripper to specify location. I'm going to wait to the end of this video to unmask the killer, so you get a feel for the frustration on the public and the police during this process. I will be referring to him as The Ripper during the timeline of these crimes. So, the Ripper was born in Yorkshire in 1946. He grew up in a highly religious Catholic household. Yorkshire was a very working class area. The north of England in general was very industrial industry based, so he most likely would have grown up quite poor. It was reported that during his younger years he did not have many friends, and at home it was said it was very tumultuous, that his dad could have a temper and would treat his mother very poorly, though there's no evidence of this and not a lot is really mentioned about it, so I can't really give you many details. When he turned 16, he left school and began picking up odd jobs, mostly labour focused. Ones to highlight was that it was mentioned he was a gravedigger for a short time, and that he even worked in a mortuary for a while. I can imagine this means he was used to being around dead bodies, and did this desensitize him for the future? In 1966, the Ripper met a woman by the name of Sonia, who he dated for many years, and in 1974 he married her. But not long into their marriage, Sonia suffered a miscarriage, and then, having further health issues, it left her unable to get pregnant ever again. To add to this stress, the Ripper's erratic employment left the newlyweds financially forced to move in with Sonia's parents. Though unknown to them, the Ripper was actually spending his spare money on prostitutes. He would cruise Yorkshire's red light areas with his friend Trevor. Which you might thinking roundabout now, Yorkshire has red light areas? Well, it did back then. Due to the industrial industry being on the decline and a lot of companies were being put out of business, which left a lot of men out of work. And being the kind of social culture that it was at the time, A lot of women weren't in work themselves, they were at home looking after the children. So when their men were suddenly out of work, they literally had no money to survive, which did force a lot of women to have to work on the streets as prostitutes. And at this time in the UK, prostitution was at an all-time high. It was a very regular thing. It was reported by Trevor that on one of these trips into the red light district, that a prostitute had tricked the Ripper out of some money and then went on to tease and brag about it in the local pubs that she'd done this to him. This was said to be one of the triggers for the murderers beginning. That, and it was rumoured that Sonia was having an affair. Now, that being said, in June 1975, the Ripper got his HGV licence and began working as a lorry driver. This allowed him to come and go, spend long periods of time out of the house at odd hours, and that not be suspicious. This was also the year that the murders started, which I don't think is a coincidence. It really seemed like as soon as he got the opportunity, he acted on it. Now, we've talked a little about the background of our killer. It's time to get into the actual timeline of his crimes. As I've mentioned, the Ripper murdered 13 women and attacked a further 8 over the years that he was active. His crimes lasted between 1969 and 1980. I say this because although the murders didn't start until 1975, his crimes actually started in 1969, when he was caught by police in the streets with a hammer and was arrested and charged for being equipped for robbery. Which, if only they knew what he actually planned to do with that hammer, as it was the signature weapon he used to knock his victims out with. Concluding, I don't think robbery was his plan for that hammer that night. This crime wasn't actually linked until after he was caught, which will be a common theme during this timeline. Some of these crimes were not linked to him during the police's investigation of the murders, but I will point this out as we go. You might think, how on earth did he manage to go so long and kill so many women without being caught? Especially when I tell you that over the course of these murders, he was questioned and interviewed a total of 9 times by police, and each time they let him go, leaving him free to carry on. In 1969, the Ripper was out driving with his friend Trevor, said to be looking for a prostitute that owed him money. He got out of the car, and a random woman caught his eye. The Ripper followed her down a dark alley, and when he got back to the car, he was out of breath, and told his friend Trevor to drive. He told Trevor about what had happened, that a different woman had caught his eye, that he'd followed her down the alley and hit her over the head with a sock with a rock inside. It was found this woman actually went to the police and even remembered part of the Ripper's number plate, but the police didn't take her seriously, and she ended up not pressing charges, which was unfortunately a common theme during the 70s and 80s of Britain. The north of England had been rich from the industrial industry and was now on the decline, making most men out of work and forced a lot of women to take care of their families however they had to. And the police in turn gave the impression that if they chose to do that, then what did they expect? Of course you're going to be attacked if you put yourself in dangerous situations being a whore. Which is disgusting, but this is genuinely like the social impression of the time. The Ripper then goes dormant until the 5th of July 1975, when a woman named Anna was attacked on her way home from a friend's. A man had propositioned her in an alley near her house, to which she had refused. Then the next thing she knew, she woke up in hospital. The Ripper had hit her over the head with a heavy object, knocking her unconscious. He was then disturbed by a neighbour and ran off. He had hit her so hard that she then had to have 12 hours of open head surgery in order to get the shards of skull out of her head. The man had also pulled up her clothes and inflicted 6 deep scratch wounds to her abdominal. There was no evidence he'd sexually assaulted her though. A month later, on the 15th of August, 15 miles away in Halifax, a woman named Olive was attacked in a similar way. It was late at night, she was on her way home, and she was attacked from behind, being hit over the head and knocked unconscious. The Ripper again was disturbed and ran off. It doesn't mention the extent of Olive's injuries, but we can imagine that she did survive them at the least. In the same month, on the 28th, Tracy, aged 14, was attacked in a similar manner. She was attacked from behind by a man who knocked her unconscious, but he then got scared by a car and threw Tracy over a wall and ran off. What was different about Tracy's attack, though, was she'd actually seen the Ripper. It was a fairly bright day, and the Ripper had actually come up and started walking with her and talking to her before he turned and attacked her. So she was able to give a good description of what the Ripper looked like. It was just a shame the police didn't know this man would later be a serial killer. The Ripper hasn't actually killed anyone at this point, and none of these crimes were linked at the time. It took a while before they realised that these attacks were connected to the later murders, and when the first 2 attacks would be included, the police were criticised for making out as if these women were sex workers and this is the reason they were attacked, when in reality there was no evidence that either of the first 2 women were. Tracy's attack, on the other hand, could not be made to fit the narrative at all, because she was only 14, and maybe this is why her attack wasn't included or linked to the crimes, like, at all. It took much longer for them to be convinced that Tracy's attack was actually done by the Ripper. On the 30th of October, 1975, the Ripper took the life of his first victim, a woman named Wilma McCann, who worked as a sex worker in the area in order to take care of her family. She'd been out working that night, leaving her 4 children at home alone. She was attacked only 100 yards from her house. She'd been hit over the head with a hammer, her clothes had been pulled up, and her torso stabbed 15 times, with evidence the knife had been reinserted into some of those 15 wounds. The saddest part about this murder is that at 5 a.m, when Wilma did not return home, her kids actually went out looking for her. They didn't find her, thank God, but they would later find out they had gone right past the field where her mother's body was found, which must have been really horrible for them. In the Ripper's confession tapes, he talks about this murder, saying it was the one that started it all, that he'd just picked her up on her way home and was giving her a lift. They were having nice conversation, and she, out of nowhere, just propositioned him, to which he goes on to say he was surprised and didn't know what she meant by this at first. He then explains Wilma's demeanour changed, that she became frustrated, saying things like, "Do I have to spell it out for you?" And when the Ripper couldn't get aroused right away, because he said he needed it to be more romantic, she made taunting comments at him, like he was useless. Wilma then began to walk away, saying he was going to take all day and she didn't have time, and the Ripper said this made him very enraged, along with the taunting comments, and this triggered him to attack her. Now, There are parts of this account I believe, like Wilma's demeanour changing. It was late, she'd probably been working all night, in a profession she was forced into. I can imagine when the Ripper couldn't get himself aroused, she would become frustrated. It was wasting her time. Which leads me to my next point, that I can believe the Ripper had performance issues because A, why would you lie about it? And B, it's quite common with serial killers like this, that are angry at women, to have this issue. And it is a big trigger point for them when they feel like their masculinity is being threatened in some way. Plus, the fact that he'd reinserted the knife into some of the wounds shows overkill, implying she did say or do something prior to the attack that enraged the killer. So, the encounter, I believe. The comments about the fact that he was just innocently offering her a lift, I don't. Like, why would you pick up a woman on the side of the road, like, if you weren't planning to do something? Why would you even have, like, a hammer and a knife in your car if you weren't planning to do something with them? Like, I know some men do keep tools in their car, but to have it so ready to hand is a bit suspicious. Like, I think he was planning to do something from the moment he picked her up. I don't believe that her comments caused her murder. I think it may have caused him to be more angry and overkill her more than he planned, but I think he was always planning to do something. Like, he'd already attacked 3 women prior to this woman, so also saying things like she was the one that started it all. Like, she clearly wasn't. You'd already attacked 3 other women. You were just disturbed, like, you were just scared off, so you didn't have chance to finish the job. 3 months later, on the 20th of November, Joan Harrison was murdered in the same way. She was hit from behind with a hammer, her clothes pulled up, and her torso stabbed numerous times. Now, Joan's murder was included in the Ripper's murders for a fairly long time, but 33 years later, it was found through DNA evidence that Joan was not actually killed by the Ripper, but in fact a man named Christopher Smith, who the police required a swab from in 2008 when he was arrested for drink driving. Unfortunately, Christopher died 6 days later from a terminal illness, so was never charged with Joan's murder. I include Joan in this timeline though, as the police really did think at the time that the Ripper killed this woman, and it's good context for the problems the police faced catching this man. Joan's murder would have created false evidence, false leads, that must have hindered them catching the real killer in both situations. On the 20th of January 1976, Emily Jackson was murdered in the red light area of Leeds. Emily is from what we would say a middle class area, quite nice and well off, but due to the financial pressure of her husband's business going under, like many industrial businesses at the time, she was forced into prostitution. Her and her husband would drive from their home at night and go into the red light area. He would stay in the pub and she would take customers out to the car. On the night of the 20th, Emily never returned to the pub for her husband. Emily went with the Ripper, thinking he was a customer. He then proceeded to hit her over the head with a hammer, pulled her clothes up, then stabbed her 52 times with a screwdriver this time instead of a knife. There was also evidence that he'd repositioned the body to make it the most shocking for the person who found it. He'd also emptied out a handbag, which will be something to note for later on. It was clear he was escalating and now arranging crime scenes. They also found a shoe print at the scene that they found to be a size 7 work-type boot, though due to the murder happening so late at night, it was hard to determine whether this indicated a type of work the killer did or whether these were just the shoes that he liked to wear out. The police then thought the killer went dormant for about a year, but in fact the Ripper had actually attacked another woman on the 9th of May 1976. Markella was only 20 when she was walking back from a party in Leeds. The Ripper had stopped and offered her a lift. Markella was very clear she wasn't doing business, though during their drive the Ripper did try to convince her to have sex with him for £5 on the grass, to which she refused. She then got the Ripper to stop so she could go wee, which, to be fair, I think this was just an excuse to get out of the car. But as she walked away near some trees, the Ripper followed after her, hit her over the head 8 times with a hammer. Then, according to Markella's eyewitness accounts, as she lay there on the grass, the Ripper got down next to her and started masturbating. He then gave her £5 and told her not to call police. After he left, Markella got up and walked over a mile with a head injury to a phone box where she called the police, which is just incredible that she had that much resilience. She must have been in so much pain. The police, however, were very dismissive of her. They first kept trying to insist that her attacker was black, even though she was clearly stating he was white. Maybe it was because Markella had learning difficulties, or the fact that she'd just been drinking that night and was attacked in quite a well-known red light area, but they just didn't take her as seriously as they should have, with one officer allegedly referring to her as a gorilla, which is just horrible. People that are more vulnerable should be protected more, not less. Markella was pregnant prior to that night, but due to the attack, she lost her baby. And due to the location of Markella's attack and the circumstances that surrounded it, they assumed she was a sex worker. And when her attack would be linked to the murders, this is how they referred to her, even though, again, there was no evidence that she was ever a sex worker. This is just the narrative that the police are going with. It was said during the BBC documentary on the case that the murder of sex workers were much harder to solve because it was far more likely that they wouldn't know the attacker. My point is, they can't overlook and dismiss a murder, but they can an attack. Once the murders and attacks did become more talked about in the press, part of me feels like they tried to stick to the fact the Ripper was targeting sex workers to reduce public panic, as it's very scary to have a serial killer out there on the loose, but it's far less scary if you don't think they're going to target you. On the 5th of February 1977, the Ripper took the life of his 3rd victim, though it would be the 4th victim in terms of the police's timeline, because they would still be including Joan as one of the Ripper's victims at this point. But a woman named Irene Richardson, aged 28, was down on her luck, penniless, and had been homeless for a few weeks at the point she decided to work on the streets out of desperation. The Ripper had picked her up and they drove slightly out of the red light area, and then he stopped right where he'd previously attacked his last victim, Markella. When Irene got out of the car, he attacked her on the grass, hitting her over the head 3 times, so hard it drove her skull into her brain 1/4 of an inch. He then started stabbing and slashing her. He would later say in his confession that he was disturbed by a car, so he threw her coat over her and left. He did miss something this time though. He left tyre prints from his car in the mud where he drove onto the grass, which just shows how close to the road he was and how he really wasn't trying to hide anything. That and the fact that he was bold enough to take Irene to the same place he'd already attacked a woman. like he really wasn't concerned about being caught. Irene's body was then discovered by a passing jogger the next morning, who obviously reported it into the police. Now there'd been a murder at this location, it was harder to dismiss Markella's attack. So it was linked not long after Irene's murder to the rest of the murders, but unfortunately, because Irene was a known sex worker, and so was at least the first murder, she was lumped in on being called a sex worker in the press when she wasn't. And I'd like to clarify that I don't think it was because they were being called sex workers that was the issue. The issue was that the police were implying they deserved it because they were sex workers. Like, to this day, if you read any official articles, they really do refrain from referring to the victims as innocent. They won't use that kind of terminology if they can help it, which is implying that in some way, like I say, they deserved it, that they were not innocent in this situation, when obviously they were. When the police began to investigate the tyre prints, they found about 100,000 cars used those types of tyres, and out of those cars, about 53,000 were in the Yorkshire area alone. This big clue suddenly became very daunting, because think about the fact that they had no computers at this time, so they were going to have to manually go through this like paperwork, writing everything down. This was going to take them forever. They researched and contacted about 30,000 car owners out of the 53,000 list, and they found nothing. And because of the amount of time it was taking and it not producing any leads, they eventually dropped the line of inquiry. After the fact, the police would find out the Ripper's car was on the remaining uncompleted list, which must have been so frustrating for them, because this is a common theme. They get so close and they just miss him on something. Only 2 months later, on the 23rd of April, the body of Patricia Atkinson was found in her own flat. She too was a prostitute and worked out of her own home. She'd met the Ripper in a local pub, and then they'd gone back to her place, where he proceeded to hit her over the head with a hammer and viciously attack her, stabbing and slashing her to death. The police would find bloody shoe prints at the scene that would match the ones found at the previous murders. At this point in the case, 4 people had lost their lives, 14 children had been left motherless, the police had visited over 2,000 homes and acquired over 2,000 statements, and they were still no closer to finding out who the Ripper actually was. On the 26th of June, Jane MacDonald was murdered and her body found on an adventure playground. She was killed in the same way as the others, a blow to the back of her head, her clothes pulled up, and her body stabbed and slashed. The thing different about Jane, though, was she was only 16 years old. The Ripper would later claim this was a mistake, that he saw her near the red light area and was watching her talk to some of the girls for a while, though clearly he wasn't too concerned about making sure his victims were prostitutes from his history. He's attacked multiple women at this point that were not prostitutes. This murder is what broke down the narrative that the police had created around the Ripper, though, because they couldn't really make out as if she was a prostitute, because she clearly wasn't. And this in turn made the public very scared and very angry. They wanted the Ripper caught now, and this put extra pressure on police to find some kind of lead, because they were literally had no clue at this point. On the 10th of July, the Ripper would strike again, attacking a woman named Marie Long, who was attacked after a night out. She was quite drunk, and the Ripper had offered her a lift home. In his confession, He spoke of her as if she was trying to sleep with him, but again, he spoke of all his victims this crudely, and she denied this happened. She did accept the lift home, however. She asked him to stop right outside her house, though he took no notice of this and stopped the car a little bit away. As Marie got out, he attacked her from behind and dragged her onto a waste ground, and then began to stab and slash her. Lucky for Marie, however, a night watchman patrolling the grounds next to the waste ground was alerted by his dog barking, and then he saw what he thought was a white Ford with a dark roof driving away from the scene at high speed. This saved her life, although the Ripper believed driving away that night that she was dead. He was very shocked the next day when he found out that she'd survived. It panicked him. He thought it was the end of the line. He was relieved, however, when he discovered that she was suffering from amnesia and could only provide a very basic description of him that could apply to lots of people. His next issue was the car. He soon after sold the car to a new owner, who did insist on giving it back to him when it broke down, but he then stripped the car down and used the spare parts in other cars that he owned, which is a very calculated move. On the 1st of October 1977, the Ripper took the life of his sixth victim, a woman named Jean Jordan. She was a sex worker that the Ripper had picked up. She was then murdered in the same way as the other women, being hit with a hammer, her clothes being pulled up, and then her torso stabbed numerous times. There were a few things different about this murder, however. For one, she was found near Manchester, meaning the Ripper was now covering a much larger area. And the second was that they'd found evidence the Ripper had moved the body, which, while there was evidence of this before, they'd figured out that because of the time difference, he'd not only moved the body, but he had returned after the murder to move the body. They figured this out, one, due to the type of fly eggs that were present in the body, because they needed a lot of shade in order to grow, and the location of the body was too much in the sun. There's no way the fly eggs could have developed to the point that they were if that's always where the body had been located. Number two, there was evidence some of the wounds on the body had been inflicted post-mortem, meaning that somebody had returned and then stabbed the body more. And they know due to decomposition, we're not talking a few hours, it was a few days later someone had come back and done this. So you might be wondering, why would he return? Why did he need to come back to the body? Well, it turned out he was returning to find evidence that he'd left, which he didn't manage to recover, and when he couldn't find what he was looking for, which made him extremely angry, which he turned and took out on Jean's body, which is why she had those post-mortem injuries. When the police began their investigation of the murder, they searched the entire area in which Jean's body was found, and they managed to recover her handbag, which had managed to fly over into a garden of a house nearby. In the handbag, they found a secret pocket with a £5 note inside. This was common for sex workers to hide their money, because obviously if they got picked up by police, they wouldn't want to have a bag full of cash, because that would be more evidence for them to be charged as sex workers. So that's the reason they did that. The police thought that this £5 note could be from the killer, and they were right. This £5 note was the evidence the Ripper was returning for. He'd given it to Jean in advance that night to make her feel more comfortable in going with him, because all the sex workers at this point were aware of the Ripper, so they would take payments from customers in advance. Now the police had the £5 note, they were able to track the serial number and find out where those notes were distributed due to it being such a newly printed one. They found out the notes had been given out in pay packets to employees of about 35 companies across Yorkshire. Now, of course, an employee could have spent some of his money out of his pay packet and then the killer got hold of it some other way, but the police were hoping this wasn't the case. They interviewed about 5,000 employees of these companies, including the Ripper. When interviewed, the police determined his alibi to be credible and let him go. Now, let me tell you, his alibi just enraged me the more I looked into it, and it will probably you. He told them he was having a housewarming party that night, and he drove some of his guests home. He gave them names of the people he drove home and some of the party guests for them to call and check. Now, my first thought hearing this was, well, you're still going to be alone driving home, like after you've dropped off your guests. So, like, you still could have murdered someone. That's not really, like, 100% an alibi. And when I looked into it even more, his alibi didn't even make sense. Like, the timeline of it, it didn't happen. Like, he killed Jean on the Saturday. Him and Sonia moved into their new house on the Monday. And then a few days after that, he'd had a housewarming party. And actually, the night that he had the housewarming party is the night that he went back to her body to try and find that £5 note. So I don't know what these police officers were thinking. They must not have checked this at all. But the Ripper would later say, after he was caught, that the men interviewing him that weekend were so tired and overworked that he could have told them anything and they would have believed it. He was the 400th person they interviewed that day. This one annoyed me because if they'd have even looked into it a little bit, they probably would have been incredibly suspicious. It's just because of the fact that they just had too many people to sift through that he fell through the cracks. As you can imagine, this line of inquiry did not lead the police any closer to finding the Ripper. They had unknowingly interviewed the serial killer and just let him go. 2 months later, on the 14th of December, a woman named Marilyn Moore was attacked working the streets near Leeds. The Ripper picked her up, agreeing on the price of £5, and when they got into an isolated environment, the Ripper had put a child lock on the passenger side door, so he had to go round and open it for her. Then, when he did, he hit her on the head with a hammer until she fell to the ground. Marilyn did manage to scream before she went unconscious, and this scream got the attention of a local dog, who ran over and started pursuing the killer. This caused him to flee and saved Marilyn's life. More tyre prints were found at the scene, but obviously he had a different car at this point because he'd already got rid of the last one and stripped it down. Even then, unfortunately, Marilyn identified the wrong type of car, which only hindered the investigation and pointed away from the actual killer. She did, however, give the closest description of the Ripper than any other survivor, and the sketch would actually be printed in the papers. A paper which unlinked survivor Tracy would see and recognise as her attacker. She then went to the local police with her mother to tell them, but due to her attack happening before the murders started and her only being 14 when it happened, they dismissed it, not believing it was the same person. But it was. On January the 21st, a woman named Helen was murdered. She was victim number 7 for this monster. She was only 18. Her and her twin sister, who was also working that night, were forced into prostitution by a violent pimp who had not been working on the streets that long. The Ripper had picked Helen up and taken her to a lumberyard. He then murdered her by hitting her on the head with a hammer, pulling her clothes up, and stabbing and slashing her to death. He then threw away her belongings and hid her body behind some lumber and left. Now, Helen and her twin sister Rita were working together that night, and Rita reported seeing a lurking brown van. This wasn't the killer, but the weird thing is that when this guy was questioned, he said he liked to watch, that he'd followed Rita that night to watch her do business, which is really gross. But Helen and Rita were working together that night, and Rita got picked up by a customer not long after Helen got picked up by the Ripper. So why did he follow Rita that night and not Helen? If that man had chosen to follow Helen instead of Rita, he would have witnessed her murder, which this guy seems to just get by on like pure luck. On the 26th of March, the body of Von Pearson would be found under a sofa in a junkyard. It was determined she was actually killed before Helen in January. At first, they were unsure if Von was killed by the Ripper because there was no stab wounds. Although she did have the signature blow to the back of the head with a hammer, it seemed she'd been more crushed to death, which didn't fit his pattern. The police would eventually decide that she was part of his victim pool, and when the Ripper was caught, he would admit this was him, and he was disturbed by a car driving close by, so he'd crushed her to keep her quiet because he hadn't finished yet, and then afterwards he'd just left. Von was actually killed on the 21st of January. She'd left her 2 children in the care of a 16-year-old neighbour, and she'd gone out to the pub. She'd left the pub at 9:30 to go earn some money, as she told a friend as she departed, but she never returned home. Meanwhile that night, the Ripper had been helping his parents move into a new house. His brother Mick and his father John had assumed that he wanted to get back to Sonia that night, and that's why he didn't stay for a drink. However, the Ripper actually bypassed his home and went into Bradford, where he'd obviously picked up Von and unfortunately killed her. Around this time, the case was gaining so much press, the whole country knew of the Ripper and were following the investigation closely. But like with every big story, people use it to take advantage for themselves. The police, soon after Von's murder, would receive hoax letters from the Yorkshire Ripper, addressed to the head of the Ripper investigation, George Oldfield. The letter would brag about the crimes and taunt police. Though the police didn't know this was a hoax letter, they were sceptical. First, it was sent before the discovery of Von's body, and she was never mentioned. The real killer would know about her. The letter did say the body count was 8, but for a different reason. They were claiming responsibility for an unsolved murder of a woman named Joan Harrison, who was sexually assaulted and beaten in Preston. This was the murder that I'd previously talked about in the timeline, the one that will be later solved through DNA evidence. She wasn't a victim of the Ripper. This letter they also tracked down, and it was sent from Sunderland, which is the other side of the country. So they did write it off as a hoax. And to be perfectly honest, they should have stuck to that, but we'll get into that later. 2 months later, on the 16th of May, Vera was murdered while she was working on the streets of Manchester. The Ripper had picked her up and drove her to the grounds of a hospital of all places. As she got out, he attacked her with a hammer and she let out 3 screams, which people on the hospital grounds did hear, but then decided it was a patient and didn't investigate. She died by the end of the Ripper's attack. He then dragged her body to a fence and stabbed and slashed her. She was found the next morning by hospital groundskeepers. I would like to note here that I have worked in a hospital, and you do very frequently hear a lot of screaming. So it is understandable how they wouldn't investigate. But saying that, you would think they would notice the difference from them being outside to inside. The police step up their investigation. Although they had been observing cars coming in and out of the red light areas, they were given more manpower. But the same problem happened as it did with the £5 note inquiry. They just became overwhelmed with the sheer amount of paperwork. They really underestimated just how many men frequent these areas. And this was before the time of computers, so the sheer amount of people they had to go through was just enormous. The idea was that they would investigate anyone that came up frequently. And a few names did keep coming up, including the Rippers. He was pulled in and interviewed by police. His excuse would be he's a long-distance driver and he went through these areas for work. The police were not happy with this. They had reports of him driving slow, stopping, lurking in his car in these areas. This wasn't a man simply driving home from work. The police then set up a second interview for him to come back, but it was cancelled due to the 10th body being found. On the 4th of April 1979, Josephine was murdered. She was only 19 years old and was killed in a very nice neighbourhood of Halifax. This put a lot of fear through the public. Was the heightened police presence causing the Ripper to just kill any woman alone now? The Ripper offered to walk Josephine home, and when they got to an isolated field, he attacked her, hitting her over the head with a hammer and then stabbing her with a sharpened screwdriver. When her body was first found, they initially thought she was a hit-and-run victim. She looked so bad. But they soon realised it was the Ripper. There was important clues left at Josephine's murder scene, though. They found traces of milling oil used in engineering shops. This was obviously because the Ripper was a long-distance driver, so I would imagine he would come in contact with his engine quite a bit. But unfortunately, they also found this type of oil on the hoax letters, which gave the letters some credibility and took away needed resources. On the upside, they got more boot prints. These not only linked this murder to the rest of the other murders, but the police were able to find out he not only wore size 7 work-type boots, but the right sole showed some significant wearing down, which indicated he used his shoes to press down for a long period of time, but just on the right shoe, which meant he was most likely some kind of long-distance driver. The police were contacted by the hoaxer again, but this time via tapes. In a similar fashion, he addressed them to the head of the Ripper investigation. He bragged about the crimes and mocked police. The man on these tapes had a Sunderland accent. The police had a choice to make here. Do they believe the tapes are real or not? The head of the investigation, being backed, decided they were. Remember, they had the milling oil evidence? They really thought this linked the killer to those letters. The police would later find out this was a mistake, but at this time they went forward re-interviewing everyone, but this time focusing on their accents. Did it match the type they were looking for? Were they trying to change their voice for investigators? This caused the Ripper to be re-interviewed again, but this time he wouldn't find it so easy. The officer interviewing him found him very suspicious. He gave short answers. He wore size 7 work-type boots. He was in the profession they thought the killer would be, a long-distance driver. He was one of the employees that received the £5 note. And most of all, he matched the police sketches of the Ripper. This officer went through with the interview. He wrote a report detailing everything. This man's link to the murders and the officer's thoughts on the way that this man was acting during the interview. Unfortunately, because he didn't match the accent they were looking for, his higher-ups would dismiss it and the Ripper was yet again let go. The police put 90% of their efforts in the wrong place going down the line following the tapes. The police even sent a squad down to the local town in Sunderland where they determined the accent was from. They played the tapes everywhere and anywhere, hoping somebody would recognise the voice and contact police. Within only a few weeks, everyone in England had heard these tapes being played somewhere, which is a big thing to say considering it was before the internet. No one would come forward saying they recognised the voice though, which I guess is even more frustrating for police because it just left them in the dark to whether it was real or a hoax. Attack survivor Tracy would come forward saying the man that attacked her did not have this accent and the man on the tapes was not the Ripper, but yet again her opinion was just dismissed by police. While all this is going on, the police were still recording the number plates of cars that were going in and out of the red light areas. The Ripper's plates had been recorded a number of times at this point, twice in Leeds, once in Manchester, and a massive 36 times in Bradford. This caused the Ripper to be pulled in for yet another interview, and it was the same officer that was suspicious of him the first time, and this interview just made him more so. When the interview was over, the officer would write a second report, insisting to his higher-ups that they look into this man for being the Ripper, and he was not taking no for an answer this time. He looked into the man's criminal history, and they found the first arrest. Remember when he was charged for going equipped for robbery with a hammer? But the report did not say hammer. It did not say what the weapon was. And it was that small detail that could have given him enough reason to dig deeper, or at least give probable cause to hold him. But it didn't, and the Ripper was once again let go. 5 months later, on the 2nd of September, a woman named Barbara Lynch was killed. She was out with a friend, and she was murdered inches from her front door on her way home. The Ripper, the same as his other victims, had hit her over the head with a hammer, pulled up her clothes, and then stabbed and slashed her body. The police found Barbara's body under the steps of her flat, covered by rubbish, where I'm guessing the Ripper made some attempt to hide her. She was also not a sex worker, so it seemed like the Ripper didn't even really care who he attacked at this point. It was literally just any woman alone. It wasn't even necessarily like in the red light areas, it was just had to be like nearby. 12 days after Barbara's murder, the man who sent the tapes and letters into police would call them, telling them it was a hoax and he was not actually the Ripper. It's unclear what triggered him to do this. Maybe he felt guilty that he was helping a man go on killing, or maybe the police were just too close to catching him and he felt like this would make them stop. Close to this time, the lead investigator on the Ripper case, George Oldfield, would fall victim to a heart attack caused by stress, being run down and not getting enough sleep. And it's no wonder with the amount of pressure on his shoulders. And it's very much said that when these tapes and letters came out as a hoax, it was absolutely humiliating for him. He'd put so much money and resources into these letters and tapes being real and producing some kind of lead, and all of that had just fallen apart now. After George Oldfield's heart attack, it caused a new investigator to take over, and due to the recent phone calls, he felt very rightly that they should drop the tapes and letters of the line of inquiry and focus on other leads. A new group of police was set up to look into the £5 note again, but they obviously didn't come up with anything, which I think this case just highlights how much technology does advance these kinds of investigations, because half of these things wouldn't have been missed if they were done via computers and not via paperwork, because a lot of these issues are because officers are overwhelmed with the sheer amount that they have to do. In April 1980, the Ripper would be stopped and arrested for drunk driving. The officer arresting him thought he looked an awful lot like the Yorkshire Ripper sketches and contacted the police on the Ripper case about this man he had arrested. But the police would tell this officer that the man that he arrested had already been checked out and wasn't considered a suspect, which is just incredible. Like, what was he eliminated for? Not having the right accent, which they'd now determined was a hoax, so why isn't he being re-looked at? You can really understand people's frustration when looking back on this case. On the 21st of August, Margaret Walls was just a normal woman on her way home from working overtime at work when the Ripper would spot her walking through Chapeltown, park his car and then catch up the distance to her. When he got close to her, he basically surprise attacked her, hitting her over the head with a hammer and then strangling her to death this time, and he didn't inflict any stab wounds. This change in the killer, he would later admit, was him trying to get away from the Yorkshire Ripper title, so this murder wouldn't be linked to any of the others, which did somewhat work. It created a lot of arguments within the police, scientists and public of whether this was the Yorkshire Ripper. A lot of people thought it was, a lot of people thought that it wasn't. However, it would be eventually linked. On the 5th of November, the Ripper would attempt to kill another woman, but they managed to survive. A 16-year-old named Teresa. She was attacked yards from her house, hit and knocked unconscious. Then, like some of the other victims, the Ripper was disturbed and left the scene before anyone could catch him. On the 17th of November, the Ripper would commit his final act of evil, killing his 13th victim, a woman named Jacqueline Hill. She was a student aged 20 studying for her English degree. Jacqueline had been at a seminar in the city centre and she was currently on her way home. She'd just got off the bus and was walking to her house. The Ripper had saw her, had drove a bit ahead of her, parked his car. Then, when he saw her pass, he got out and began to follow her. When he found the opportunity, he surprise attacked her, hit her over the back of the head with a hammer, pulled up her clothes and repeatedly stabbed her with a screwdriver, even once in the eye, which is a disgusting thing to do to someone. Jacqueline was the last known victim of the Yorkshire Ripper. It wasn't long after the Ripper would get stopped by a police officer checking number plates. The car the Ripper was driving, his plates didn't match the model of car, so this is why he was initially pulled over. The Ripper pulled over willingly, and he was actually in the company of a prostitute at the time. He got out of the car, but as the police officer turned his back to grab something from his car, the Ripper slipped away for a moment. As the officer began to look round for him, the Ripper popped back up, saying that he just needed to go to the toilet. The officer noted this at the scene because it's a very odd thing to do. It's a weird interaction. The Ripper was then taken to the police station to be interviewed because he matched a lot of the killer's characteristics. And as they interviewed him, he also matched a lot of what they were looking for. As we've mentioned before, he had the right size of boots, he was in the right job, he'd received one of the £5 notes, his car had been recorded a lot in the red light areas. Like, it was all adding up, and I'm glad this police officer actually took him in and interviewed him instead of just being pushed off like a lot of the other officers were. The problem was the Ripper was coming up with a lot of excuses, and the police had no real proof apart from this circumstantial evidence. But remember the weird interaction? The police officer went back to that scene where he'd initially arrested the Ripper to search the area to see if he'd really gone to the toilet or if he'd thrown something, which he was right. This police officer was right. When he'd returned to the scene, he found a knife, a hammer and a rope, which when they presented this stuff to the Ripper, he confessed to everything. And it's worth a note that him being arrested at this point probably saved the life of the woman that was in his car, because he had a knife, he had a rope, he was definitely going to do something to her. After this point, the Ripper's home was searched and they found all the evidence they needed: DNA matches, blood, weapons he'd used, including a handsaw that he used to cut Jean's body up with when he went back. The knife he used to stab a lot of his victims he'd also got from his kitchen set, which is just incredible. During the interview, when he was asked to change his clothes so they could take them for evidence, he was wearing a jumper upside down on his body. So the legs were through the armholes, which they thought that he used this to masturbate, so that he could pull down his pants, have access to his bits, and still be somewhat covered. There was no evidence of sexual assault on the actual victims, but you remember Markella's eyewitness account stated that he did sit down on the grass and masturbate next to her. So maybe this is something that he regularly did, but we don't really know, because obviously the victims aren't alive to tell you whether he did or not. He denies any of his killings being sexually motivated, but that doesn't mean that they weren't. The Ripper himself claims that when he was working his graveyard job, God spoke to him and told him to rid the world of prostitutes. And this is something he claims strongly, that he was doing God's work, that God would tell him who to kill. Which the Ripper would later be diagnosed with schizophrenia, so I can somewhat see how that would fit in. As somebody that's worked with a lot of mental health disorders, I can kind of see where his actions would show schizophrenic behaviour. He was very impulsive. He didn't seem to plan out any of his murders, in the sense of the actual murder itself, who he killed. It seemed to be very random, in the moment he saw someone, he did something. It was never fully planned out. And they were always seeming to be prostitutes, or at least who he thought were prostitutes, which again, somebody that's not in the right state of mind could easily mistake somebody for something else. But equally to that, he would do a lot of calculated things, like going back for the £5 note, for stripping his car down and putting it into other bits of his car, throwing the equipment away when he was arrested so that he wouldn't be caught. There's a difference between being out of your reality and having a delusion. He clearly knew that what he was doing was at least deemed wrong, otherwise he wouldn't be trying to cover up his actions. So mental health doesn't always equal that it's okay. Which the courts did agree to. He made numerous claims for diminished responsibility, which were denied. The actual killings themselves were not thought through, but he did go out to kill someone, and that is planning. 2,000 people showed up to the Ripper's trial. And who was the Ripper? He was a man named Peter Sutcliffe. He was given 20 life sentences for his crimes, despite his claims for diminished responsibility. His sentence was also increased to a whole life order in 2010, which means that, in the UK it's basically the same as being given the death sentence. It's a sentence given to somebody that the court believes that no matter how much rehabilitation options are given, that there is just no way that this person would be fit to be in society ever again. While in prison, Sutcliffe was attacked by an inmate, which is very common for serial killers. They were at very high risk of this. But he was stabbed on the left side of his face with a smashed coffee jar and required 30 stitches. He would then be attacked twice more over that year. Once an inmate tried to strangle him with a headphone cable, and the second time he would be blinded in his left eye by an inmate stabbing him with a pen. It was noticed Sutcliffe was suffering from serious mental health problems, and he was soon moved to Broadmoor Hospital, where he was diagnosed of having paranoid schizophrenia, and he would remain there for a while before being moved back to a high-security institute in the Berkshires, where he would remain until 2016. In 2016, a health tribunal found that the now 60-year-old will no longer need treatment for any mental health disorders, and he was transferred to Franklin Prison in Durham. His wife would divorce him, change her name, remarry, and move away. There's no real trace of her anymore, and I don't really want to bring her into this because, well, she didn't do anything wrong, and I imagine being attached to a man like that could ruin your life. On the 13th of November 2020, Peter Sutcliffe would die. He'd had numerous ongoing health issues, and during the COVID pandemic, he contracted it and it unfortunately killed him. And I say unfortunately because I really believe that men like that deserve to rot in prison just thinking about what they've done. Before he died, he would actually say that he was haunted, plagued by his victims, that when he closed his eyes, all he would see is their faces, which I think is exactly what he deserves. In tying up loose ends before I end this episode, the police would find the man who sent the tapes in 2010. It was a man named John Humble, and he got 8 years in prison for perverting the course of justice. They actually caught him because of the advancements of DNA testing now, and there was like a small trace of gum on one of the letters, which they'd obviously managed to match the DNA that they got off the gum with John. So that was the Yorkshire Ripper case. I hope you enjoyed it. It took so long to compile. There was just so much to it. And all the books that I'd read, documentaries that I watched, everybody had so many different focuses. Some chose to focus on the police's mistakes, others the killers, and others the actual victims themselves, feeling like they weren't properly given a tribute at the time. I tried to cover a bit of everything and give you a well-rounded view of the case. I hope that you enjoyed that aspect of it, and that's today's episode. Thank you so much for stopping by, and I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave your reviews and thoughts on this episode. Maybe give me a suggestion if you really want to see me cover a particular case. Your feedback is always appreciated. It helps me improve my content. And stay tuned for next week, and I hope to catch you again on the Planet of Horror. Over and out.